All right. Is there coffee back there?
I told she wanted to come over and show me, and I said, oh, come over to have a trip. You know where the candy is?
You have plenty of candy in the room.
No, you don't have plenty. So we read them. Yes, yes. Did you get coffee, Jesse?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Are you gonna come back from the church anytime this week?
Oh, yeah, my sister lives just down the way, so I
I'm
can.
gonna give you something to put in the preschool, box by Stephanie's door.
I'll be glad to.
Okay, it's all working. Great. Grand, glorious. Oh boy. All right.
Are you packed yet?
No,
I asked him.
haven't even started. But I have a wonderful wife who set out all the things I need, like my passport, my vaccine card, and I'm very excited because I've got approved just in time. I got my pass sanitaire, so I can travel freely about France without having to get a COVID test every 72 hours. Yeah. Well, I think it's funny because I applied as soon as you have. Okay, if you're not a French citizen, you have to have purchased your plane ticket in order to apply for the pass. So I couldn't apply for it until I purchased my plane ticket. So as soon as I did, I applied for the pass, and that was like 2 weeks ago. And I'm like,
Go ahead.
time is getting short, you know. I still would have been able to fly into France. It's just that I would have, if I had to go to a hotel or get on a train or anything like that, I would have had to have a negative COVID test in order to do that, which is a pain in the butt. But what happened, it was funny because I got approved at 9:17 on Saturday morning, and it shows you the steps. So it showed me that I applied, but then it shows review and process and then approval. I got review and process at 9:14. I got approved at 9:17.
Wow.
So it's literally my application was sitting there for 2 weeks. Somebody pulled up the file, hit a button, and then that was it. Right?
Wow.
You know, because all you send in is you send in a picture of your vaccination card, picture of your plane ticket, and a picture of your driver's license. That's it, right?
Huh.
And they're just approving essentially that you got vaccinated, which I did. So, great. Anyway, so that load is off my shoulders. So I've got my pass sanitaire, my passport, my international driver's license. There's so many documents that you need to
Who's
take.
that?
Yeah. Okay, let's talk business. Let's talk stuff. Susan, remind me of your in-law's name.
Bob Huckabee.
Bob Huckabee. I should remember that. So Bob Huckabee, potentially, it probably is going to be here on November 21st. Bob is of Native descent and can speak much more authoritatively, I'm guessing, at least on the experience side of things. So he's going to be here on the 21st. I'm very excited for that. Susan, I'll check in with you when I get back from France and all
So
that.
the next 2 weeks, no adult.
Next 2 weeks, no adult ed. Your adult ed will be a sermon from somewhere in the French Riviera or something like that. Yeah.
French Riviera.
Well, Comps is technically in the French Riviera, but it's not really. We won't actually be spending much time down there. We're going to be in Bourgogne for a few days, and then we'll be up in the Vosges Mountains. So Bob Huckabee will be here on the 21st, which is perfect timing because we're going to wrap up the narrative arc of the Grand Ronde Reservation today.
You very briefly mentioned Native sort of religious traditions
Yes.
last week, but that's all we've heard.
Yes.
Is there more you're going to expand on, or should
Yes.
I be reading myself?
So that will be when we pull the lens back a little bit.
Is he a Grand Ron?
He's very active in the Grand Ronde community, but he's actually a Creek from Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
Creek?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cree. Yeah. No, Cree is Canada. Creek. Yeah. Yeah, because Northern Cree is way up there. I think. Anyways. There's a musical group literally called the Northern Cree Singers, which is amazing, and I'm not using literatively, figuratively. It is literally members of the Cree tribe that now release CDs, release albums of native songs in native voice. And it's different music, right? It's the type of stuff that you'd hear at a powwow or whatever. But they. So this is a bit of a tangent, but it's worth talking about. So Canada is amazing for the musical arts and other performing arts because, similar to like Sweden, they have public dollars that are available for people that are doing traditional folk music, right? So in an attempt to preserve the heritage of that, Canada literally pays people to do this stuff. So there's been a genre of music which has kind of sprung up in Canada, which is native music but adapted into modern voice, which is they have native singing powwows every year. There's actually competitions where groups of native singers will come in, and it's the video. I've done a deep dive into YouTube on this stuff. The videos are super cool because it's a bunch of people, men and women, sitting around a drum, right, and they're all holding a drumstick in their hand, and there's like 15 of these groups of people on like an auditorium floor, right? And one group will sing for like 5 minutes, and then another group will sing for 5 minutes, and it's a competition, right? They're being judged on it. And of course, the Northern Cree singers are some of the more famous, and they've won most of the competitions. I have not been able to tell what they're being judged on yet, but it all sounds amazing. But now there are many modern Canadian recording artists, especially like electronic music artists, that are working with like groups like the Northern Cree and adapting their music into like modern electronic music. It's really cool. You kind of got to be into that thing, right? So like in a lot of like modern like pop music, you see so and so featuring so and so. It's kind of it'll be so and so featuring the Northern Cree singers.
Sounds like something Sting would do.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, that would be Sting. He's one in the world music fund, isn't he? Okay. Sorry, Susan, to answer your question directly, when we dial back the lens a little bit to look at the bigger picture, that's when we'll talk about native beliefs. And primarily, the reason that I didn't talk about it in depth in this is because the beliefs picture covers a broader geographical thing. Fascinating piece about this, and this is one of the pieces that I find absolutely interesting, is that you have similar pantheons, for lack of a better word, all over the U.S., right? Like the similarity in native beliefs is mind-blowing in that you have almost every native culture in North America at least has, for example, a trickster god. But the animal, or that is anthropomorphized as that trickster god, varies depending on where you're at. For example, in the American Southwest, it's generally coyote, right? Coyote is the trickster god. But if you go up into the Pacific Northwest, it becomes crow or raven, often is portrayed as the trickster god, because it depends on what their biology or what the native species are that they see a lot of. But the underlying kind of like, I don't know how to describe it, the foundational divine concept is consistent across the entire thing. And then of course, almost all of the native beliefs in North America have a kind of a unifying understanding of a great spirit of some sort. We'll get into that at a later date, because that spans a big area. But good reminder. So today we're gonna wrap up Grand Ronde, bringing us into the modern era. I do want to leave a little bit of space for conversations as well too, because the last couple of weeks I've been just trying to steamroll through all this stuff. But let's catch up on where Grand Ronde is today. So last we talked, we kind of left off with beginning of restoration, right? So termination, 1954 through 1957-ish. Mid-80s is when the restoration movement finally bears fruit. And we talked about that. The restoration movement begins in the early 80s, and 82 is when the legal process begins for Grand Ronde, but it isn't until 86, I think it was 86 or 88, that they actually get acreage back. 88, March 14th, 88. So a quick recap there too. So just a reminder that the original Grand Ronde Reservation, which starts in modern ancient Spirit Mountain, but middle of the Cascade, middle of the coastals, goes beginning all the way to the coast. That reservation area is shared with the coastal peoples as well as with the Silex, as well as with the starts with an A, Alua, something like that. The way that the reservation gets split up is they take a big chunk out of the middle, divide and conquer. The southern piece gets sold off. The Silex reservation gets reduced, and then through attrition over time, by the time termination occurs, that total land mass is reduced to a bare fraction of what it was. When restoration occurs, out of the original 1.4-ish million acres that comprise the totality of that reservation, what is returned in 1988 is 9,811 acres. Right? So still a sizable chunk of land, but of course just a bare fraction of what originally made up that area. So where that land comes from, if I'm repeating myself, stop me, but I can't remember the details. Where that land comes from, it's all BLM land. So those 9,811 acres come out of Bureau of Land Management land in Yamhill County, and of course it takes an act of Congress to make this happen. What's interesting is that even as that land is being restored, what is the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes are already working on public relations, right? So you can imagine. So what do people do on BLM land nowadays, right? Hunting, fishing, hikes, timbering, grazing. All of these things happen on BLM land. So what happens when you take a chunk of roughly 10,000 acres of land? You have the potential for conflict, right? Because this land that was previously accessible for these things now is under ownership of the Grand Ronde tribe. So what the Grand Ronde tribe did, in order to kind of ease the fears of not only the people of Yamhill County, but also the timber companies that had been lumbering this land, was that they negotiated a specific plan both with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to continue to allow access for hunting and fishing and stuff. But also, they promised not to compete in the timber market for 20 years. So in other words, they promised not to, as an individual entity, monetize the timber resources that were on there, which in the long run paid great dividends because it basically eased the fears of the timber community, but it allowed them 20 years for them to navigate the legality, but also the financial aspects of beginning to harvest the timber resources that are on that land.
Did they lease the land to the timber company?
Not at that point. That happens eventually, right? Because after 20 years, so this is 2008. Then that agreement ends, and they started. That would probably we would need to talk to the Grand Ronde tribe. It doesn't specifically mention the mechanics by which they begin harvesting timber, but the timber receipts that they get become one of the main funding sources, aside from casino income. One of the main funding sources for the tribe is harvesting the timber on that land. Also, and here's another key piece, is they agree then that when they do harvest, they'll set aside 30% of timber receipts specifically for the economic development of Yamhill County, right? So it's a really kind of fascinating model that they're using in restoration, which is what 200 years before was intended to be a out of sight, out of mind, almost, not almost, segregation of these peoples, reignites with the people to whom the land is returning, trying in their best to incorporate land use in the county that they reside in. So in other words, no longer is this a philosophy or a strategy of we're here isolated away from everybody else. It's this is where we live, this is the community in which we're embedded, we're going to do our best to work with them. And that is a strategy that you see played out from 1988 onwards, which I think is super cool and probably attributes to the success of the Grand Ronde community going forward. Additionally, they set aside monies, they promised to set aside timber receipts to help with the revenue that would have been lost by Yamhill, Polk, and Tillamook counties, but that's whatever. What do I want to talk about next? One last thing. So, I kind of glossed over it. Well, I didn't gloss over it. I mentioned it briefly last week. Is that in a lot of ways, the restoration movement that happens in the 80s, which coincides coincidentally with the gambling bill, from a cynical perspective, you could say as being what's the word I'm looking for? Start with a C.
Consolation.
Consolation, right? A consolation, it's a settlement that the Native peoples arrive at with the government. So this is under the Reagan administration. So from a cynical perspective, you could point out, again, that the land that's being returned to them is but a bare fraction, not only of the land that they started with originally, but the land that was taken from them in 1954, right? You could point that out. You could point out that they're having to essentially pay back for the land that they're receiving, right? Because if you look and say, well, they're setting aside 30% of receipts in order to help work with the county, you could argue, well, why should they have to do that? Why should they have to pay anything at all since it was land in the first place? But what is fascinating is when you look at statements made by the Native peoples, there is very little desire for retribution. And I want to be careful here because there's a tendency amongst us white folks to look at a situation where, and not we, but our ancestors or our society irrevocably harmed a group of people and say, oh, well, but they forgave us, right? And that doesn't really do justice to the situation, right? Because you can't just erase this stuff, which is really, when it gets boiled down, a lot of the conversation that's going on about black equality right now, about racial equality, which we get given these two false choices of either you have, either you go this extreme, either you go the direction of, self-flagellation and everything's wrong, etc., or you go this direction. Well, I don't know why they could just. It was 200 years ago, etc. That's not. Those are false choices, right? I'm not an expert in this, and I don't claim to be. But in reading this history and reading the outcome and in reading the reaction by the Native peoples, one of the things that I find extremely admirable is that they are able to straddle this line of saying that was a long time, that happened, that happened a long time ago. We can't return to the way things are. We're not going to, hold that against you. But at the same time saying, but it's important that we know the history of what happened, right? Is the ability to hold those things in tension. So this is happening in the midst of the Reagan administration. And the primary thing that the Native peoples, the Grand Ronde Reservation wants people to remember, so what the elders are repeating over and over and over, is that just don't forget termination, right? So, yeah, we got back a fraction of the land. Yeah, our tribe, our community is irrevocably changed, right, as a result of this. But don't forget what happens when you essentially sign away a group of people due to convenience, right? And I was just having this conversation with Andy in the sanctuary, and this is extremely important because we, as Americans, and we've talked about this for 8 weeks, haven't done a great job of telling this history because it's inconvenient for us, right? Not only, and that's some of it, but also our history is us-centric, all right? Everybody, arguably, their history is that way, right? We always want to be the good guy in our story. And so that's the way that we have taught our children about history. And it's really inconvenient to bring up the examples of we're not such good people. And an example of this, for example, is how I remember being taught about the Vietnam War, which was I wasn't. It was mentioned. They talked about the number of people that died. But at no point in any of my history classes, in high school or college, I didn't take many history classes in college, engineering track. Did we ever talk about, I never learned about the Viet Cong, I never learned about the actual political situation in Vietnam. I didn't learn about any of that stuff. I didn't learn even the number of Vietnamese that were killed over the course of that war, which is exponentially higher than the tens of thousands of people that we lost, right? So, to be fair, this is just kind of how we have handled history. After studying this, one of the things I've realized is that it's so important to study this because this isn't the first nor the last time this has happened in history. In fact, if you look at our nation's relationship with freed slaves and with their progeny, right, you can see very many correlations. If you look at apartheid in South Africa, you can see correlations. If you look at the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can see correlations. And if you look at that one in specific, and this is what Andy and I were talking about, the uncomfortable thing is that one of the justifications that we made, and we talked about this, for our seizure of the land, aside from the divine right of conquest or the doctrine of discovery, was that there just weren't people there, right? I mean, inconvenient that the reason there aren't people there is because 90% of them died to disease that we brought to their shores. But the lands were empty, right? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, literally, people were taken from their homes, moved, miles to the east and said, this is where you live now. And one of the things I always find powerful about that is that there are families that still have the keys to their original home, right? They're still holding those keys. And that's, again, not about picking sides in a very, what is a very complex topic, right, in our modern era. But it's understanding this is how we as human beings tend to treat those that we have power over, those that are inconvenient for us. And it's that we need to learn from our mistakes and do better in the future, right?
Well, like you said, in school, it was never discussed, it was never a history lesson, it was never dwelled into about that. The only thing we ever learned as we were growing up was what we saw in the TV movies, and the Indians were always depicted as bad guys.
Yeah, because it fits the narrative trope, right? It fits the story of good guys, of clear-cut good and evil, of the hero and the arch-villain, that.
It wasn't until Tonto that we realized it was a human being.
right, yeah. It wasn't until we actually created a native character that was a real human being with real human thoughts, which, again, is not his story as old as time. Have you ever read, The Hero of a Thousand Faces? Joseph Campbell. Fascinating book. Little deep. But, this is the whole thrust of the book is he is showing how, from an anthropological perspective, how humans have a history of creating the same hero over and over again, and how we can draw correlations and comparisons between, starting all the way back with prehistorical mythology, up through Greek mythology, up through modern storytelling, how we're kind of reinventing the same hero over and over again, how Achilles and Luke Skywalker have a lot in common. Anyways, Paul.
I'm going to take this down so people can hear me. This is an aside, but a few weeks ago, there was an article in the Oregonian about the Grand Ron opposing a casino complex proposition that would be private.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you read that. But,
Yes.
it had to do with having a casino and then having a horse race betting. Anyhow.
Where was it going to be?
Wood Village near Portland. That's where they wanted to put it. And I'm not. So they were not Native Americans.
I did not hear a peep about that. I'll have to look into it because I don't know any details on that.
says, if there was any doubt, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde once again have demonstrated their political and financial clout when someone threatens their bread and butter. So
Yeah.
they're always gonna be, you know, up against something. Backers of a proposed casino in Wood Village say they, and I'm not getting everything.
But is gambling illegal? Is gambling legal in Oregon? For a
On the
private?
casino, on the reservations.
Yeah,
I'm
so
getting-
it was gonna be a private, I'll look into it, because I'm really curious about that. I mean, I'm not shocked at all. And of course they'd be opposed to it, you know, it is
Yeah,
the
yeah,
finish
but
line.
they're forever gonna be fighting some kind of
Oh, yeah,
territorial battle or, you know, something to.
gambling is a lucrative sport.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's why A is in Ridgefield. They tried to open it here in the Troutdale area.
Yeah,
And everyone said, you're not Indian, you can't do that.
huh.
And they ended up in Ridgefield.
I
And
don't know
they're Canadian.
enough about the history. I gotta call my mom's friend Lenore.
It's a casino-related measure. It remains on the ballot and results won't be known until the votes are counted November 6th.
Huh. Well, vote on Tuesday.
No,
Yeah.
Canadian. Well, Canadian, it could be Canadian
Yeah,
Indian,
it could
but
be.
it's Canadian. That's why I
Ah.
don't gamble there, because then my money goes to Canada.
I don't know anything about the, but I guess there is video of it. Anyways, I can go down the rabbit hole. Thanks, Paul.
Canadian investors are behind the measures.
How is that? Okay.
Great Canadian Gaming
So it's
Corp,
the same
Yeah,
thing.
same.
Clairvest of Toronto.
I will look into this. That's fascinating.
Just thought I'd throw that in.
No, I appreciate that. Again, I don't know why that didn't pop up in my newsfeed. But it's Mark Zuckerberg's algorithms. That's why. Okay, so I promised that we'd talk about modern stuff. So let's talk about that. So I mentioned last week as well. Again, this ties in with making timber receipts available to for the benefit of the broader counties. I mentioned last week that Grand Ronde created a fund of over $300,000 for the Willamette and Sheridan school districts, from gambling receipts. So, an important piece to understand here is over the course of the restoration process and leading into the modern era, the philosophy is different. I already said this. It's no longer, and to be fair, the philosophy of the Native peoples when they were placed on the reservation was not theirs to control. All right, this was our philosophy regarding them, separate, kind of how we handled segregation, but not equal. Separate but not equal. Right? Just keep them over there, out of sight, out of mind. And now that we're in the modern era, that philosophy is much different now that they're in control of the agency of it, which is they see the importance and the necessity of being embedded in the community that they exist in. So important things that happen post restoration, and I already maybe spoke to this a little bit, is that they then take all of the monies that they're receiving, whether it's through timber receipts or gambling receipts, and use it for the promotion of cultural education, social welfare, and tribal identity. Right. So, because if you think about it, 30 years between termination and restoration. All of the communication is being done from a shack, right, on the tribal cemetery. Imagine how much cultural knowledge is lost over those 30 years. Okay? The efforts of the community since then have been almost primarily and intentionally focused to recreating that understanding, right? Reclaiming that identity, right? And this is evidenced by the fact that they began teaching Chinook Wawa almost immediately after the restoration of the reservation. One of the first things that they did was they created a Chinook Wawa dictionary. Right? And again, for me, I nerd out on this because it's so interesting to watch now that there are resources available, that these are the things that are important, right? Rediscovering our language. And if, from an anthropological perspective, you can point to the death of a civilization based on the death of its language, right? that either precludes the decline of that civilization or it marks the end of that civilization. And that's bridging off into weird philosophical stuff. But then, additionally, once they create the Shinnecock dictionary, they begin providing classes on Shinnecock for every grade, beginning at elementary school out through high school. So kids that are going to public school, that in Yamhill or Polk or Marion County or whatever, can come take Shinnecock classes at the reservation. Right? And the one thing I didn't find is if they, here it is. And they negotiated with the high schools that it would fulfill their foreign language requirement, right? So, right, they get to learn foreign language, which is actually their native language. And how stinking cool is that? If I would have had the opportunity to learn, I don't know, Chippewa. Yeah, if I would have had the opportunity to learn Chippewa as a high schooler, I probably would have done that rather than German, which I don't remember any German. Bleistift is pencil. Dummkopf is stupid. I know the only German I know now are the swear words that Luther used in his writings.
Little did you know you needed French.
Yeah, I know. Right? Well, again, and I scoffed at taking French. I don't know why. If I knew what I knew, if I knew then what I knew now.
Yeah.
And just to put a number value on this, the cost of both the creation of the dictionary, but more so teaching these classes, is almost $1 million a year. It's about $800,000 per year that the tribe is spending specifically on these education coaches that has zero financial return, right? So this is purely a benevolent thing. And they teach tons of other stuff, right? So they do activities like beading, basket making, drum making and playing the drums, moccasin making, canoe making. They show how their ancestors built homes back 200, 250 years ago. These classes are taught by members of the tribe, but it's similar to how we've already covered all the similarities between churches and tribal communities. Those are taught by just about anybody that has the knowledge. So, like, if you go on to that Grand Run Educational Trust's YouTube page, you'll see one of the fascinating ones I was watching was a dude that taught a class on traditional carving, and he's not a professor of this stuff. It's just somebody that does this stuff because he enjoys doing it, right? But he's explaining, how what the best wood to use is, and how you do this, and how they used to do it back in the day before they had modern chisels and stuff like that. And it's just super cool because we talk about social media, right? This is tribal media. It's very, very neat to watch. And again, if you want to spend an afternoon, go on that YouTube page, and you can spend more than an afternoon. Is there anything else that I want there? The other piece is that they, at least the Grand Ron community, has also shared of their cultural wealth. For example, they have made traditional canoes and donated them to museums, not just in Oregon, but internationally. So there's actually a cedar bark canoe that was donated to the British Museum in London, right? So again, it goes in line with them wanting to spread cultural education and appreciation for them. Okay, here is one of my. I was so excited about talking about this last week, and I didn't get to it. Here is one of my favorite, just kind of like snapshots of the ridiculousness of us, which is that. Have you heard of Tamanawas before? No? How about the Willamette Meteorite? The Westland Meteorite?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So, Tamanawas, which is the Chinook word for it, is a meteorite that fell to Earth thousands and thousands of years ago, but was deposited in West Lynn, modern-day West Lynn, by the Missoula floods, which I don't know anything about. Somebody that does know about it could tell me about it. But it remained in West Lynn, modern-day West Lynn, until 1906, when the American Museum of History in New York comes, takes it, and moves it back to New York. The thing weighs 15 tons, and it's one of the largest intact meteorites ever to fall on the planet. Well, here's the inconvenient reality of it, which is that Tamaulipas was a sacred site for the Grand Ronde people and the native people of the area. They literally referred to it as one of the sky people, right? So in their thinking, this was potentially a divine object that fell to the earth, and it was a sacred sacred pilgrimage site for a long, long time. You know, we don't know potentially how long. So in 1906, some group of white people comes and says, "This is our history now." Takes it and moves it back to New York. Why to New York, I don't know. But finally, in 2001, Clackamas Indians and the Grand Ronde Reps have made an annual trip to New York to be reunited with the Tamaulipas, and they have their private ceremony over there. And I'm just like, this is just, for me, it's just mind-blowing.
And what importance is it to the museum in New York?
Well, because it's one of the biggest.
It's a decent representation of meteorite.
Google it. It's huge, right? It's 15 tons, but it's, you can't wrap your arms around it. It's super cool looking too.
It's a rock.
It's a rock. Yeah, it's a rock.
No, it's iron.
It's an iron meteorite. Yes. It's pitted. It's super cool.
And they couldn't send scientists here to study it?
Yeah, but that was 1906, right? I mean, to be fair, Napoleon stole the whatchamajiggets, the obelisks from
Yeah,
Egypt.
that's true.
This is just what colonial
Yes, New York colonialism. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. The history was, it was a native site, a settler who didn't buy the land that it was on,
No.
but knew it was there,
Yeah.
actually moved it from that site to his land. Then in the Lewis and Clark exposition, it was exhibited, and then he, quote, sold it, unquote.
Yeah, to the museum. Yeah.
It wasn't even his.
At bottom line.
Yeah.
Was it down in the water?
No, it was up in West Lynn, higher up.
It was higher up?
Yeah.
How did anything like that got higher up?
It was
The
a
flood-
little
the flood-
coming out of high
Yeah,
school.
So, sorry, this is like Indiana Jones gone bad, right? This is essentially what we're talking about. But also, and if you look it up, well, I'm not going to do it right now because it's going to mess up the stream. There is a historical site in West Lynn that points at.
Is it a hole in there?
This is the former site of the Tamana, but it's referred to as the West Lynn meteorite, not
Right.
Tamaulipas. Maybe that has changed now, but as of whenever the Wikipedia page was created, it's still the West Lynn meteorite. So it has nothing to do with the native people's history. We're such great people. Okay, so let's talk current day relationships. So Spirit Mountain Casino is the most profitable and most generous gaming enterprise in all of Oregon. So Spirit Mountain is the biggest. And here's the really interesting statistics. So I mentioned, back in, was it 2000, whatever, it's not 2000, whatever, it was mid-90s, they set aside a $300,000 fund for for educational purposes for the school districts. That's continued. So the Spirit Mountain Community Fund gives 6% of its profits annually to support education, arts and cultural organizations, health and environmental protection, historic preservation. They use it to combat gaming addiction, which is an interesting thing, but that's responsible use of money, and public safety. And in recent years, because of the decline in the local economy, they have primarily directed most of their money to basic human services. So they've pivoted away from just cultural education and more that kind of stuff directly to social and human services, right? Seeing the need in the community around.
When I was teaching and doing IEPs, individual educational plans, for any kid who had native blood, there was always an advocate from the Indian Council there.
To represent them.
Yeah. That their rights were being fulfilled.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
I think if you can prove that you got native blood, you can also get scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big destination for a lot of that money. And again, to put a number value to it, since 1997, they've given away over $26 million to over 350 organizations. Right. So I don't know. I think that's pretty cool. I don't gamble, not because I see any moral illness in it, just not my favorite entertainment. But way to. The Spirit Mountain Casino itself employs over 1,500 folks as well too, which it's no small source of employment for Yamhill County and Polk County and the surrounding counties as well there too. I mentioned earlier, talking about the main thrust of the tribal elders is not to forget termination. If you were to ask nowadays, the current mission is to make sure that the past does not repeat itself, right? Which is what we were talking about. So one of the primary concerns of the tribe is that they are seen as self-sufficient, right? That they're not relying on public monies, that they in and of themselves are contributing to the local economy, they're contributing to the well-being of the county that they're in. And again, this is just good PR in a lot of ways, but I also think it's coming from a generous heart and coming from a good place. So the the council that governs all of this is made up by tribal members. There's a tribal council that decides what to do with the Spirit Mountain community funds. The council, hand picks which organizations are being funded and all that stuff. Similar to how our scholarships are handed out. Again, there's no lack of similarities between churches and tribes.
Is there any mention of repurchase of land?
Not here specifically, but in our news sources over the past 5 or 6 years or so, yes, right? Here's
or meteorites.
Yeah, right. Here's the gap in my knowledge with regards to Grand Ron. I don't think, but I can't say that with 100% confidence. I don't think that they have actually repurchased any land. They have been gifted land, right? The work that's going on, or what's happening at Willamette Falls specifically. Do you know was that a purchase agreement at the end? Okay.
I think so.
The other examples in Oregon that I know of that popped up in the news recently, and again, these are primarily gifts of land, where Burns Paiute got a huge chunk, and that was interesting because it was a private individual who had owned it and gifted, it was like 20,000 acres, something significant like that, to the Burns Paiute reservation. And there was a super cool story on that because they had some awesome photos of the first kind of spiritual pilgrimage that the tribe did onto this land that they had recovered. That's a whole other interesting facet, which I think would be fun to explore in future conversations as well too, is looking at what the current conversation is around that, right? We talked a little bit about it a 3 weeks back, because, and again, and we talked about this a little bit about a half hour ago too, is that there's this fine line between outrage at the fact that tribes are not being forced, but essentially the only option available to them is to purchase land that was taken from them in the first place, while also celebrating that tribes are able to purchase land and are financially self-sufficient and able to do that, right? So there's a success story in there, and it's okay to look at that and say, but is this really how this is supposed to work? Yeah.
It's so ironic because the concept of owning land wasn't with the Native Americans.
And still isn't to a greater. I mean, because keep in mind that the land that's being returned to, for example, the Grand Ronde tribe is not individually owned; it's communally owned, right? So Willamette Falls is going. That's going to be, I assume, part of the Grand Ronde reservation. And again, even in the language they're using, they see it as collectively belonging to the people who inhabit this area, not just exclusively to the tribe, which is why they're making it an educational resource for everybody in Portland, and whoever wants to come see it. So from a philosophical sense, it's not, they never really, From a philosophical sense, we've never really did completely assimilating tribes into our understanding of land ownership. In some regards, I mean, it's on an individual basis, it's obviously different. But sorry, that's a really interesting debate to pursue here. And just, there's a couple of just random notes that this book makes mention of. For example, they talk about in 2000. Well, this was 5 years ago or so. But in the modern era, one of the most beloved things that any of the existing the members who were around when termination happened, the most celebrated thing is when their grandchildren want to learn Chinook, right? Is that they take great pride in the resources that their community offers, because it means that their grandchildren can learn about who they are, right? And can re-engage in that piece of their identity. So it's neat. That's modern era. That brings us up to the present. Any questions or comments or conversation about that? The question I have for you guys relates to kind of what we talked about already, and maybe we don't get too in depth today. But what do you imagine as being the road forward, even for our community, right? Having had our eyes opened to a certain extent, is what things do you desire? I mean, obviously, hopefully, you found this stuff interesting. But now that we know intellectually about the Grand Ronde Reservation and the people and the history of that people, what is there opportunity for Milwaukie Lutheran Church going forward? Are you interested in pursuing a relationship, if willing, with the Grand Ronde Confederated Peoples? Because those are the folks that we're going to be able to find out from, who specifically were the people that lived here. And maybe there's joint stuff in the future. Is that something that you might find interesting? Sorry, it's kind of a loaded question, but I'm not really going to accept no as an answer. But
Who will build the cat?
what's that?
Who will build the cat? I mean, you're asking what kind of work is involved. I don't know what kind of work is involved in a relationship with this community.
And do they want
That's the
a bunch of
big.
Norwegians
That's the
selling
big.
them out?
That's the big question, right? That's the big question. And this is also why I see the benefit of Mr. Huckabee coming in. Is that's one point of contact. My intent is that not before Christmas, but starting in the new year. I'll reach out to them before Christmas, but my intent is to establish a line of communication with somebody from the Grand Ronde tribes and see if it's possible, to pay some speakers to come out and talk more in depth on this topic. And this is just a bit of a teaser, but our land and housing cohort, which I don't think any of y'all are on, and Susan's right in front of me. Matt Millenbach and I had a conversation earlier this week, just kind of it was a random conversation, specifically around, we've got acreage out there, and who knows what we're going to do with the parking lot going forward, or if we'll do anything with it. But if we were to do something like create a community garden or green space out there, we were imagining what would it look like to get input from Native peoples, right? Grand Ronde, about what did this land look like, and is it possible to create in some form an educational monument or an educational thing that speaks about the Clackamas people that inhabited this land, And we don't have any concrete of what that might look like. It's just kind of where our wondering is going. I am keeping track of time. It's very popular right now amongst community organizing groups to do land acknowledgement, which is great, right? That's nothing wrong with that. I wonder what the next step is after acknowledging the land, right? Is there a next step?
Well, like I mentioned to you earlier this week, one of the good starting points is the archives over at the Milwaukie Museum.
Yep.
Because they have file cabinets full of records of what this land may have looked like.
Mm-hmm.
and who it belongs to.
Yeah. My vested interest is hearing that directly from the voices of, because, we could do more intellectual research. At some point, I think it's more interesting, potentially, to hear that directly from the people themselves, as opposed to hearing. I'm absolutely going to check out the Milwaukie Museum, no doubt about it. But I think that's the benefit of having, a relationship. The reality too is that, and I think this is good organizing practice, which is that what that relationship building might look like is walking alongside of, accompanying, and listening to start, and then seeing where that goes. Susan, sorry.
Two things.
Yeah.
I may have already mentioned this. 1992, there was a Oregon sesquicentennial celebration, and people were invited to walk the last couple of miles of the Oregon Trail, ending up in Oregon City. And a lot of us white folks did.
Yeah.
And we got to the river, and there was a huge Native American contingent. And it's like this major shift in my brain. It's like, ours isn't the only story here.
Yeah.
Then the second thing is, at the Portland Art Museum, this is said at the beginning of every tour, and I think it's also in writing, and it's an acknowledgement. It says, the Portland Art Museum recognizes and honors the indigenous peoples of this region on whose ancestral lands this museum now stands. These include the Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Walale Chinook people, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and many other Native communities who made their homes along the Columbia River. We pay respect to their elders, past and present.
That's a textbook example of a land acknowledgement.
Yeah. And I think we could have something like that here.
I think that's a great idea. I would love to do that as well too.
Okay.
I think that's wonderful. Any other?
I'm just wondering, in being allies, obviously the
Yeah.
most important thing is to listen and understand from the folks themselves what they understand. But I think the educational piece that we might be looking at could involve some kind of encouragement of people to tell their own story in video form, movie form, something like that. What I keep coming back to is that we're pretty behind the curve in media.
Yep.
And I think most people now get most information in that form. And their eyes are awakened not by the pilgrimage to the river, like Sue just did, which is great. That's a limited number. Even to know that that's a possibility would be something that probably is accessible more by movie than anything. So the telling of their own story in movie form, rather than the Hollywood version of InGens,
Yeah.
is really a critical piece
Yeah.
too. And I don't know. That's just my take on educating us about anything.
Well, and I suspect too that potentially I might reach out and they might say, well, we've actually got a whole library of videos that you could watch.
Right.
And I'd be, okay, yeah, we can do that. Additionally, we have the technological capability, or at least of actually doing a Zoom call with somebody that could speak to us, or we could teleconference with somebody,
There you go.
which in the COVID era might be more reasonable and reliable than trying to get somebody to come in person. So, yeah. Whew, my coffee is starting to leave my. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm getting a 10,000-yard stare. My brain is starting to wind down. Thanks, folks. So no adult ed next week or the week after, obviously, on the 21st. Mr. Huckabee is going to be here to speak. We'll update you with information on that.
Mic off.